Right, were you actually born in Barnard Street or?
No, I wasn't. I was born in Lindley Street, which is just further down Earl Road from Barnard Street. Exactly the same sort of street, you know. 80 houses, 40 on either side, all exactly the same. None were any different. Very poor area. 99% of the people were poor in those days. Because Liverpool was a city of contrasts. We had the very rich and we had the very poor. And the year I'm talking about is 1930, because I was born in December 30. So we were in the middle of a depression then.
Would you describe the houses?
The house. All of the houses were the same, as I've said. They were terraced. They had 2 rooms downstairs and 2 rooms upstairs.
Where was the toilet?
The toilet was in the backyard. And there was a backyard, and that was it. And the houses, they weren't back-to-back houses, because there was an entry running along the back. But they were nearly back-to-back. And there was no electricity in any of the houses. So we didn't have any hot water other than what was boiled on a gas stove.
Well, how did you have a bath?
Well,
Was there a bathroom?
there was no bathroom. The only water in the house was in the little, one of the 2 rooms downstairs, which we call the back kitchen. And in there was a small coal fire. There was a small gas cooker. And there was a marble type sink with a cold water tap. And that was the extent of it. So,
that was one of the 2 rooms downstairs?
2 rooms.
And that was one of them?
That was one of them.
Which had the kitchen and everything in it. How big was this room?
At most it was about 10 feet by, we'll say 10, 12. That's as big as it was. And the front room, which a lot of people call the parlour for whatever reason, that really wasn't much bigger. But usually in that room, you know, they had like a sofa and odd bits and pieces, because nobody had very much. But in the kitchen we had like a table and chairs and this gas cooker and a coal fire, and that was it. Now when you said, how did you have a bath? We only had a bath once a week, because on either a Saturday night or Sunday morning, my mother had to boil all the water, and we had a tin bath. And you must have heard jokes about people saying they had a tin bath on a nail in the yard. Well, we did. And they'd bring the tin bath in, put hot water in, put cold water in, and if you're lucky, you went in first, and if you were unlucky, you went in last. But at that time in that small house, there was Peggy, who was the oldest, Bill, who was next, Alice, and me. Now, my memories now go back to when I was about 4 or 5. By that time, we were living in Barnard Street. But the conditions in the house where I was born were exactly the same. And so that's how it was. And as I said, the people were poor, really poor. Poor enough for kids who would go to school. And some of them didn't have adequate shoes. Some of them didn't have any shoes, the odd one. But when I say adequate shoes, things like in the winter, they'd wear sandals, regardless of the weather, or things we call plimsolls. Some kids used to call them pumps, I don't know what you call them. But that's where they were. And they didn't have warm coats. They might be lucky and have a jersey. Now, we were fortunate because my dad had a job. And because my dad had a job, we were reasonably well looked after. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had a hell of a lot more than most of the other people. Because what you have to bear in mind is, okay, the First World War had been over about 12 years then. But jobs, there were no jobs. Men found it very, very difficult to get a job. And married women in those days, they didn't work. So odd ones would have maybe a couple of hours cleaning somewhere. But that was the extent of it. So, you know, this picture of this city was like that. Terribly poor, very rich, and running down the middle classes. And the middle classes could be counted as people who might work in offices and stuff like that. And the not so poor were the ones who actually had a job. But jobs were really hard to come by. And that situation...
If you never had a job, what finances did they? How did they?
Well,
there was no dole then, was there?
There was no dole. Not so far as I can remember. I remember something they used to talk about as being the parish. And the parish was a handout from, and I'm not sure whether it was government funded or local authority funded, but whatever they got was a pittance, really. But there was no social security benefits or anything like that. I mean, if you didn't work, you were reliant on this parish charity, really. And that was something I think that came in as a result of something called the Poor Laws. But it was very little money.
Of the 80 streets in your 80 houses in your street,
yeah,
would you hazard a guess how many of them were working?
It would be very difficult, but I would stick my neck out and say the majority of them were not working. And they were either not working because they couldn't get a job, or because they were disabled, because you must bear in mind...
Straight after the war.
First World War, lots of men came back. It wasn't uncommon to see lots of men without a leg, without an arm, blind, all of that sort of thing. I mean, the social conditions were absolutely awful. But I would say the majority of them probably weren't working, you know, which was really dreadful.
So out of 80 houses, say 60 of them were not working?
I would have thought so, yeah. Yeah.
And we're totally poverty stricken.
That absolutely awful. I mean, you know, just to give you an idea how poverty stricken some people were, opposite to where we lived in Lindley Street, and I don't actually remember this, but I remember being told this, there was a family. The father had lost his leg in the First World War, and he wasn't working. Too many kids. Most people had far too many kids. And I can remember my mother telling me about the Parrys sent one of their kids over to our house with a shovel, you know, and said, can you put a bit of fire on that so we can get our fire going? Now, you know, that is terrible, isn't it? I mean, my mother said she shoved up some hot coals, and this kid went trunking across the road to set their fire going, and that's what happened in those days. Having said all of this, I never ever felt disadvantaged. But then I say, we were lucky, because my dad was working, and we were really quite well off.
Yeah, you didn't feel disadvantaged when you compared yourself to what was the norm and where you lived. What was Christmas like? Food and presents and clothes?
Christmas for us was 100% better than for anybody else.
Yeah.
Christmas time, we had Christmas dinner. What it was, I can't remember. But it probably wouldn't have been at that time, you know, up until I'm talking now, between being born and 6 years old.
Yeah.
It would be meat of some description, roasties and stuff like that. And we always had a Christmas stocking. I can always remember that. It would be one of my dad's socks, but and in that Christmas stocking we would have an orange or a tangerine. We'd have a few sweets, and we always had a new penny, because I think the Royal Mint minted new pennies especially around that time. And in there there'd be odd little bits costing pennies really, and that would be the but we always had one present, and that present would be a sweet shop for the girls, or a small doll, or a nurse's outfit, and the lads would get, I don't know, a train or a fort or something like that. But we always got one. And didn't have loads of presents to open. And you know what? We were as excited about that, more excited probably, than the absolute oodles of presents kids get nowadays.
Yeah.
And that was it. And I can always remember that on Christmas Day, our Uncle Georgie Barr, who is Denise's father, I mean, these kids may remember or know Denise, he used to come round, because he wasn't married then, and he used to give us sixpence, I think, which was a hell of a lot of money for us kids, because our pocket money from my dad every Friday was 1 old penny, and we looked forward to our Friday penny.
What could you buy with a penny?
Pardon?
What could you buy with a penny?
You could buy quite a lot of sweets. That's what we used to buy.
Yeah.
Because, you know, everything was relative.
Yeah.
Wages were low.
Yes.
Prices were low.
Yeah.
And we could buy quite a lot of sweets for a penny. And as we got older, you know, when you got to, say, 10 or 11, it went up to 2 pennies. But some kids never got anything.
So the farthing was still in circulation and used, was it?
Sorry?
A farthing was still used then.
Oh, yeah. And I suspect that there were certain things that were a farthing in price in those days.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't remember any, but I'm sure there would be. Farthing was in for many, many years, wasn't it? And of course, what we haven't touched on is going to school. We went to school from 9 till 4 every day, Monday to Friday. And we used to have a lunch break, and I think it was about 1 o'clock till 2, or maybe a bit, I can't remember the exact times. And we used to come home for our dinner, because naturally school was just down the road, didn't have to walk very far. And the school, with hindsight, I look back and think, the teachers were dedicated in those days, because they were teaching these poor kids who had nothing, who had parents who were totally overwhelmed by their domestic circumstances, the lack of money. You know, it just got on top of the parents. So the parents really didn't encourage the kids, or couldn't. It wasn't in them. Didn't have the energy, I suppose. But the teacher was all good. They used to take us to all sorts of places. Like, okay, kids will take it for granted now. Museum. We'd never been to the museum, but the teachers took us. Take us to the park to play games. Take us to the swimming bath. And when I think back to those teachers, I have a lot to be grateful for, to most of them. Some of them were not very nice, but then I suppose some of the kids weren't very nice either, you know. But they were really good, and they tried to lift the kids out of their environment by various means, introducing them to books and stuff like that, you know. So no complaints about school. Left school when I was 14. I suppose I could say I was literate anyway, could read and write.
Could most of the people leaving school at that age read and write?
Pardon?
Could most of the people leaving school at 14?
Oh yeah.
You,
well, certainly.
They could read and write though, could they?
Oh, no doubt about that. I mean, obviously some of them couldn't, but then they were the ones who, we used to say, sagged school. Didn't go to, for whatever reason, they wouldn't come to school. And the parents didn't push them to go to school, because some of the parents wanted the kids at home because they could do jobs and stuff like that. Yeah. But we had, in those days, they had what they called a school board, and they employed men who went round to houses where kids were persistent non-attenders, you know. And the parents, I don't know what happened to the parents. They were threatened with being taken to court, but I don't know. It'd be pointless taking them to court, because if they find them, they didn't have any money to pay. So, you know. But school was, in my view, was good. Well, the school I went to was good.
How did you keep yourselves occupied out of school over weekends and holidays? Because, of course, there was no television then.
Yeah, I think, I mean, what you have to think is, we didn't have television.
No.
Because if you didn't have electricity, you didn't know, and television wasn't. It had been invented, I think, in the 30s, but it had never been introduced to the general population. We had a radio. Now, the radio, again, no electricity, so we had to have what they called accumulators, which were charged bottles of, I think it was probably acid.
It would be like a car battery, which is a...
Yeah, just like a
acid
car battery. And the radio used to be connected to these accumulators, and we could listen to the wireless, as they called it. And I was a great listener to the wireless. I would listen to anything. I was also a great reader. I was always going to the library. I was just always had my nose in a book. And other than that, we would run the streets, you know.
What sort of games did you play? Because, of course, there were no cars then.
We played things like Yaleo, which was all in a long line. Do you remember Yaleo?
Yaleo.
Yeah. And I can't remember how it worked, but one person used to go up and tick, and you'd have to run, and all the other kids used to have to find you. I'm not sure about that, but we also played a game with the street lamps. The street lamps had bars on the top, still some of them around now, and we used to get ropes and put them over, and that would be like a swing, and we'd go round on that all the time. Simple things, but you were mainly out of doors. Didn't have kids sitting inside, you know, glued to a laptop or a PC now. None of that, because there wasn't any. But we were always highly entertained, and the parents in Barnett Street particularly, I remember this very clearly. In the summer months, the whole, well, not the whole street, but the majority of the street would all go to Sefton Park, and they'd take butties and lemonade made from lemonade powder and water, and all these parents and all these kids, and we'd all walk to Sefton Park, and they used to play rounders against each other, one side of the street against another. And that was a load of fun. And the funny thing is, nowadays, my childhood is all sunny days, or snow, making snowmen, or Uncle Georgie Bar making us a sledge out of 2 bars of wood and tin cans split and nailed on the bottom of the runners, you know. I can remember him making that. And all those sort of things. And we used to have a thing called a steering cart, which was a piece of wood and 2 wheels on the front and 2 wheels on the back.
Usually salvaged off a pram.
Always off of an old pram, these wheels. And the front bar swiveled like that, and you had it attached to ropes, didn't you? and Georgie Boy used to make that. So all of these things that kept us occupied as kids were homemade, really. Very few kids had bikes, because bikes were expensive, so they couldn't afford them. So they made their own. And I can just remember having a lot of fun with things like that.
Did you ever have any other trips out to New Brighton or Blackpool or anywhere?
New Brighton we used to go to. My mum and dad used to take us to New Brighton, and we'd get the tram, no buses in those days, the tram from Smithdown Road right down to the pierhead. Then we'd get the ferry over from the pierhead to New Brighton, and my mother would be laden with butties, tons of butties, pardon me, and again, you know, the lemonade powder drink that they'd made. And when we got to New Brighton, I mean, it was packed. You could hardly get on the ferry. You know, if it was a sunny day.
This would be of a weekend?
Oh yeah, Sunday. Because the husbands, if they were working, they worked till lunchtime at least on a Saturday. So they only had Saturday afternoon and Sunday off. And we'd all go off to New Brighton, be there all day. And there was a place on New Brighton Prom that all they did was tea, and you'd go over, be sent over for the tea, for however many there were, and pay for it, and you'd get a huge tray with all cups and milk and sugar, and a big pot of tea, and trundle it back wherever you were on the sands. And then you'd religiously take all that back, because they didn't charge a deposit on it. And I thought, I wonder if they'd do it nowadays. They'd dump them on the sands, wouldn't they? But we didn't, took them back. And that was what happened in the summer months. I mean, I'm sure that we would have been taken to other places, but I can't really remember, to be honest.
Can you remember any particular celebrations or events like the beginning of the war, the end of the war, the coronation, anything like that, street parties?
Well, I mean, I remember the end of the war very clearly, but I was left school by then.
Yeah.
Because the war ended, was it 45, something like that? I was working then. So I can remember the war being over. I can remember war being declared, which I've already told you about. I was on the train.
So why were you on the train?
Going to the evacuation.
You were evacuated?
Yeah.
Oh.
To
How old were
a
you?
place called Port de Norwich in North Wales. Well, it was September 1939, so I would have been 8. And our Alice, who came with me, would have been nearly 12. And we were on this train, which we all went from Edgehill Station. And the event I remember most is walking from Earl Road School with this long, long crocodile of children who were all heading for Edgehill Station to be evacuated. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't know for how long we were going. And to most of us, it was an adventure, because we'd never been out of it. We knew we were going on a train. And an awful lot of them had never even seen a train, never mind being on one. But that was us getting evacuated, and the kids had their belongings with them. And if you were lucky, you had a little case, and your mother or father had packed it for you. If you weren't, you had a pillow slip and all your gear, you know, clothes and everything, whatever you had. Because bear in mind, some of the kids didn't have much. And we had a gas mask. Cardboard box like that, with your gas mask in.
Well, this was in 39, so that was before war was declared.
Well, as I said to you earlier, I was on the train before we heard the war had actually been declared. because we were on our way to North Wales by then. And all of these kids went. By the way, not every child went, because some families, the mother had to stay behind to look after the younger kids.
If you didn't know that war had been declared, why did you think you were going?
Oh, well, we knew that it was going to be.
Right.
Because we'd had this period where everybody was obviously worried and what have you. And even though we were only young, that communicated itself to us. And we thought, something's going on. And they said that we'd already been told that we were being evacuated in case the Germans declared war and they started bombing the cities. So we all had a good idea of that. But it was still an adventure. Yeah.
How long were you evacuated for, and what was your
we
family
were probably one of the shortest two evacuees. As I said, we went in September and we were there all told 8 weeks, our Alice and I. Because you must also bear in mind, the outbreak of the Second World War, nothing happened. They called it the phony war. Because as soon as it was, we all expected we'd get bombed and everything, but nothing happened. So there was loads of kids living in Wales, running riot in Wales, I might say. Because, looking back now, I think the village we went to was tiny. And it was between Bangor and Carnarvon, a little tiny place. And all of a sudden, all these Liverpool Arabs landed on them. And these kids were wild, absolutely wild, running all over this village. And now I feel really sorry for the people who lived there, because some of the kids were horrendous. Tough, really tough kids. But our 8 weeks came to an end. My mother and Auntie Esther had been all ready to see us. They trunked all the way from Liverpool to see us. And they went back. And I think it was about 3-4 weeks later, my dad came unannounced. And I can remember sitting on this hill in this little tiny village, and a man walking towards me. And by this time, I'd never stopped crying, by the way, from the day we arrived at this place. A man walking towards me and thinking, that looks like my dad, I wish it was my dad. And it was him. And of course, as soon as I saw him, wanted to go home. And he took us both home. Although we were really well treated by the lady and the man who we were lived with. Really looked after us very, very well.
There was just you and Alice in there with this?
Me and Alice together.
So when you went back to Liverpool, were you in Liverpool for the rest of the war?
Absolutely.
So what was it like? Did you
for
experience
start,
any raids?
When we came back, it was still phony war. Nothing was happening. But there was no school. Because all the schools had closed down. Because all the teachers had taken all the kids to wherever to be evacuated. Because it wasn't, some parents went it, but in the main, it was the school teachers who looked after all these kids. So came back to Liverpool, didn't go to school for, it must have been nearly 2 years. Or it must have been that. So we were just running around. And of course, in 1940, we did have a couple of instances where the air raid sirens went. And odd bombs were dropped in. But as a general run, that wasn't a bad time. I can remember lying in bed in Auntie Esther's house with her, and the siren going. I can remember being very frightened with this, and Auntie saying to me, "Oh, it'll be all right, it'll be all right." I can remember that very clearly.
Why were you in Auntie Esther's house in bed?
Oh, because when I was a little kid, I used to spend most of my time in Auntie Esther's house. And I suspect now, I spent most of my time there.